In early April 2023, Paizo posted a draft of their replacement to the Open Gaming License 1.0a, the Open RPG Creative License, or ORC. And I thought it would behoove us all to have a look at the document and compare it to 1.0a. Now, full disclosure, I am not a lawyer and nothing I say here is legal advice. All I've done is read through both documents and picked out the elements that strike me as important from a layman's perspective. If you're so inclined, I'd recommend having a look at the April 2023 draft of the ORC for yourself. You'll find a link to it in the description of this video. I've broken today's video into 3 sections. 1. Terms. This is how the ORC outlines what it's talking about. 2. Grants and limitations. This is what the ORC allows and what it doesn't. Finally, in the 3rd section, I'll be going over the differences between the ORC and OGL 1.0a. To begin, terms. Like a lot of legal documents, the ORC uses exact terms that are not common to the English language, so it provides definitions of those terms and what they mean in the context of the draft. In this version of the ORC, there are 2 terms that strike me as significant. Number 1, product identity. This refers to creative elements that don't impact the mechanics of the game. These are things like story, characters, music, iconography, dialogue. Any of the elements that could be swapped out without actually impacting the mechanics by which the game is played. The other term is ORC content. These are the systems and subsystems that make the game playable. Things like character creation and all that entails. Stats, attributes, skills, abilities, spells, equipment. Also, systems and classifications. These would be things like combat, skill checks, monster stats, resource management, in-game turns, and other mechanics that the game uses. ORC content also covers methods by which players interact with the game. These are things like dice rolls, coin flips, random number generation, maps. Even dialogue is covered by the ORC, as long as it's how players interact with the game. Finally, methods by which success and failure are determined. These would be things like AC, CR, and DCs. So, basically, ORC content is the mechanical features of the game. But there's an interesting caveat. The licensor can choose to make aspects of product identity part of the ORC content. So, to use Paizo as an example, if they wished, they could make their setting of Galarian useful as part of ORC content. And with that, let's move on to grants and limitations. The primary grant of the ORC license grants the licensed the right to use, in whole or in part, ORC content. This grant is worldwide, royalty-free, non-sublicensable, non-exclusionary, and irrevocable. Now that we know what the primary grant is, let's discuss some of its limitations. First, the ORC license is not connected to or supported by the licensor. As far as I understand it, this means that you do not, as a licensed holder of ORC content, you don't have the right to produce official content of the license issuer. So to continue on with Paizo as an example, you do not have the right to produce official Pathfinder content just by having accepted the ORC. The other limitation I'd like to talk about is, to the extent possible, the licensor waives the right to collect royalties for the use of ORC content. This seems to address one of the major issues that people had with Wizards OGL 1.1. The fact that it seemed like Wizards was attempting to squeeze smaller publishers and developers for royalties. Alright, now let's take a step back and look at OGL 1.0a and see how it stacks up against the ORC. The first area of change that I noticed was in product identity. In OGL 1.0a, product identity was a little more narrowly defined. It's basically just a long list of creative elements that are not connected to mechanics. This strikes me as a necessary update for modern technology that's been developed since 1.0a has been released. Now, like the ORC, OGL 1.0a does not imply any connection or endorsement of the licensee's work by the licensor. So that remains. Alright, now we get to what I think is the most impactful change made to the language between these two documents. 1.0a states that the right to use the licensed content is worldwide, royalty-free, non-exclusive, and perpetual. The big difference between that and the ORC is the ORC states that these rights are irrevocable instead of perpetual. Now, why they chose to replace perpetual with irrevocable, I can't say. I also don't know if irrevocable implies some sort of time limit where it's not perpetual. But this is just a draft after all. We'll have to check again when the final document is released. There's also another big difference I think is worth examining. 1.0a is meant for Wizards of the Coast content only, whereas the ORC is meant to be system agnostic. Hence, the language refers to licensor and licensee instead of specific companies and organizations. So now we've looked at and compared both documents. But I also think it's important to remember why the ORC was created to begin with, and what caused this whole mess. It was the stewardship of Wizards of the Coast. The language of the ORC, to my admittedly untrained reading, is more solid than 1.0a. But whoever ends up with the license may, at some point in the future, find the means, the motive, and the opportunity to try the same sort of overreach that Wizards has. But that being said, this is just a draft. Maybe they really can produce a license that's absolutely ironclad. We'll just have to wait and see. Thank you very much for watching D6 Damage. This channel is dedicated to covering tabletop role-playing games, such as Pathfinder 1st Edition. And if you're looking for more coverage of Pathfinder, classes, DMing tips, and much, much more, check out D6 Damage on BitChute or YouTube. And if you'd like to take your game further, join the D6 Damage Discord. We've got fantastic discussions about all aspects of the game. You'll find a link to the Discord in the description of this video.